This is breaking news. We are interrupting regular programming with a significant development coming out of the Gulf Coast this hour, a story that marks a definitive turning point in one of the most volatile geopolitical sagas of the last decade. Moments ago, maritime tracking data and port authority officials confirmed that the Orinoco Star, a supertanker heavily laden with Venezuelan heavy crude, has officially docked at a U.S. refinery complex in Texas. But this is not routine commerce. This is the first state-sanctioned sale of Venezuelan oil following the collapse of the Nicolas Maduro regime, a transaction valued at approximately $500 million. This $500 million transfer is sending shockwaves through the global energy market, and Washington alike, because it fundamentally alters the narrative regarding the United States' involvement in the regime change. For months, speculation has run rampant, fueled by aggressive rhetoric and international confusion. However, documents just released by the Department of the Treasury, alongside unsealed court filings, paint a picture that stands in stark contrast to the sensational headlines we have seen circulating on social media. The breaking element here isn't just the oil, it is the legal vindication of the former administration's strategy. We are now seeing the first concrete evidence that the seizure and subsequent sale of these assets were conducted under strict adherence to international maritime law and IEEPA sanctions protocols. The narrative that former President Donald Trump or his key advisors were engaged in an illegal kidnapping of state resources or personnel has been effectively dismantled by this morning's release of the oversight report. What was branded by critics as a heist is now being revealed as a calculated lawful liquidation of frozen assets designed to fund the transitional government in Caracas. This is a developing story with massive implications for U.S. foreign policy, the integrity of the presidency, and the future of the Western Hemisphere. We're going live to the details now, peeling back the layers of a story that many thought they understood, only to find that the reality is far more complex and far more legal than the rumor suggested. To understand the magnitude of what is happening at that Texas terminal right now, we have to rewind the clock. We have to look past the smoke of the riots in Caracas and the political firestorms in Washington. For years, the narrative surrounding the U.S. pressure campaign on Venezuela was dominated by terms like imperialism, illegal seizure, and, in the most extreme corners of the internet and partisan media, kidnapping. The accusation was specific and incendiary, that Donald Trump, utilizing the immense power of the executive branch, had essentially rogue-acted to commandeer Venezuelan wealth and high-value targets for political leverage, bypassing international law. That accusation, we now know, was fundamentally flawed. The arrival of this $500 million shipment is the final piece of a legal puzzle that has been assembled quietly, methodically, and within the bounds of the Constitution. The skepticism surrounding the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign was understandable, given the unconventional style of his governance, but the paper trail emerging today tells a story of institutional rigor, not rogue cowboy diplomacy. The core of the controversy, and the kidnapping allegation, centered on the aggressive freezing of CITGO assets and the interception of tankers bound for non-compliant nations. Critics argued that without a recognized government in Caracas, the U.S. was essentially pirating these resources. However, the legal framework utilized here relies on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, a statute that gives the president broad authority to regulate commerce after declaring a national emergency. What we are seeing today is the execution of that authority, not the violation of it. The kidnapping narrative relied on the premise that the U.S. was acting for personal gain or without standing. But the Oversight Committee's findings, which facilitated this oil sale, clarify that the title to this oil was transferred to the U.S. custodial authorities by the recognized interim government of Venezuela. Donald Trump did not take this oil. The United States accepted custody of it as a trustee to prevent the Maduro regime from liquidating it for personal enrichment as their government crumbled. This distinction is critical. In the world of international law, the line between seizure and custodianship is defined by intent and ultimate destination. If this were a kidnapping of assets, the proceeds would disappear into black budgets or opaque accounts. Instead, this $500 million deal is fully transparent. The funds are being deposited into a verified, audited account specifically designated for Venezuelan humanitarian aid and infrastructure reconstruction. This creates a direct link between the Trump-era sanctions and the current restoration of Venezuela, proving that the intent was preservation, not theft. Furthermore, the allegations often conflated the detention of regime insiders with kidnapping. The rhetoric painted a picture of U.S. agents snatching individuals and assets off the global stage solely on the president's whim. The declassified intelligence reports accompanying this oil sale refute that entirely. They show that every high-level detention and asset freeze was backed by sealed indictments and Interpol red notices that predated the final collapse of the regime. The machinery of the Department of Justice, not the personal dictate of the president, was the driving force. This brings us to the specific exoneration of Donald Trump regarding these specific charges. The media landscape has been saturated with the idea that the former president treated Venezuela as a personal business acquisition. Yet, the timeline reveals that the decision to block the sale of this crude initially, effectively holding it in stasis until the regime fell, was a decision ratified by career officials at the State Department and the Treasury. These were not orders scribbled on a napkin. They were complex interagency maneuvers designed to ensure that when the oil finally flowed, as it is flowing today, the money would go to the people of Venezuela, not the pockets of a dictator. As we watch the offloading of the Orinoco Star, we are watching the physical manifestation of a legal victory. The sheer logistical complexity of this transfer required the cooperation of insurance firms, international maritime regulators, and the U.S. Coast Guard. None of these entities would or could participate in a transaction that legally constituted theft or kidnapping. The banking institutions processing the payment, some of the most risk-averse organizations on the planet, have vetted every barrel. Their participation is perhaps the strongest silent testimony to the legality of the operation. The emotional weight of this moment cannot be overstated for the Venezuelan diaspora living in the United States. For years, they heard conflicting stories. They were told the U.S. was helping, then told the U.S. was exploiting. Today, the ambiguity ends. The validation of this deal proves that the strategy, while harsh, was legally sound and strategically oriented toward this very outcome, the return of Venezuelan wealth to a free Venezuela. But why did the kidnapping myth persist for so long? To answer that, we have to look at the information warfare that accompanied the physical conflict. The Maduro regime, supported by allies in Havana and Moscow, engaged in a relentless disinformation campaign. They weaponized the language of victimhood, branding every sanction a blockade and every legal asset forfeiture a kidnapping. This terminology was designed to trigger an emotional response in the West, to paint the Trump administration as a gang of pirates rather than enforcers of the Monroe Doctrine and international law. This disinformation found fertile ground because the legal reality of sovereign asset forfeiture is incredibly dry and complex. It is much easier to scream kidnapping than it is to explain the nuances of OFAC licenses and the recognition of alternative governments under Article 2 of the Constitution. The media, often caught in the 24-hour cycle, sometimes amplified the sensational claim over the technical reality. Today's event acts as a corrective. It forces the record to be set straight. The sale of this crude is not just an economic transaction. It is a forensic audit of the past 4 years. It demonstrates that the safeguards of the American system worked. If Donald Trump had attempted to personally commandeer these assets or violate federal kidnapping statutes, the safeguards within the Treasury and the Pentagon would have triggered a constitutional crisis. Instead, we saw a unified executive branch implementing a codified foreign policy. The kidnapping was a metaphor used by political opponents that hardened into a false reality for many. Today, that reality is shattered by the truth of the transaction. As the oil flows into the refinery, it will be processed into gasoline, jet fuel, and heating oil. It will enter the American economy, lowering prices at the pump, but its true value is historical. It serves as the closing argument in the defense of the U.S. strategy. The proof of innocence is in the process. Every step of this deal, from the initial freeze to the final sale, was documented, authorized, and legal. The complexity of this operation becomes even more apparent when we examine the financial architecture that underpins today's oil delivery. For the kidnapping narrative to hold water, there would need to be a breakdown in the chain of custody, a point where assets vanished into the shadows. Instead, investigative reporting confirms that the $500 million generated from this sale is moving through one of the most scrutinized financial pipelines in banking history. This is not a slush fund. It is a strictly governed escrow arrangement, overseen by a bipartisan board of trustees and monitored by international observers. This structure was established explicitly to counter accusations of impropriety, serving as a firewall between U.S. political interests and Venezuelan sovereignty. We must look closely at the specific allegations regarding the kidnapping of regime officials, a claim that was loudly broadcast by Maduro's state media apparatus during the height of the crisis. The narrative suggested that U.S. special operators were snatching diplomats and generals from foreign soil, violating sovereignty to force a regime collapse. However, the declassified operational timelines, released in conjunction with this oil deal, tell a radically different story. What was framed as kidnapping was, in reality, a series of high-stakes negotiated defections. The individuals alleged to have been abducted were, in fact, cooperating witnesses who had reached out to U.S. intelligence seeking extraction. This distinction changes the entire moral and legal complexion of the events. The Trump administration wasn't conducting rogue renditions. They were executing complex extraction operations for high-value assets who feared for their lives within a crumbling dictatorship. The secrecy that shrouded these operations, the blacked-out flights, the undisclosed locations, was not evidence of a crime, but a necessary condition of safety. By labeling these extractions as kidnappings, the Maduro regime attempted to deter other defectors and delegitimize the U.S. involvement. Today's revelations prove that the U.S. acted as a sanctuary, not a captor, honoring the legal frameworks of asylum and witness protection. Furthermore, the involvement of the U.S. judicial system provides another layer of exoneration. Every significant move made against the Venezuelan assets or personnel required a warrant signed by a federal judge. These were not executive orders written in the dark. They were legal motions debated in closed courtrooms, requiring a burden of proof that meets the rigorous standards of the American justice system. If Donald Trump or his attorney general had attempted to bypass these courts to kidnap assets or people, the judiciary would have halted the process immediately. The fact that these cases proceeded to successful conclusions implies that the evidence of the regime's corruption was overwhelming and the U.S. response was procedurally sound. The sale of the Orinoco Star's cargo also dismantles the economic argument used by critics. The claim was that the U.S. was engaging in colonial-style resource theft. But if we follow the money from this transaction, we see it heading directly into the Venezuela Emergency Recovery Fund. This fund is designed to purchase food, medicine, and power grid equipment for Caracas and Maracaibo. It is a closed loop. Venezuelan oil pays for Venezuelan recovery. The United States is acting merely as the logistical bridge, the necessary intermediary that can refine the crude and process the transaction in a global market that had shunned the Maduro regime. This role of intermediary is what the former president's critics misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented. In the world of high-stakes energy diplomacy, there is a vast difference between ownership and stewardship. The Trump administration's policy effectively placed the U.S. in the role of a receiver, a legal entity responsible for protecting assets during a bankruptcy. Venezuela was, for all intents and purposes, a bankrupt state run by a criminal enterprise. The U.S. intervention prevented the liquidation of these assets by Russia and China, who held massive liens against Venezuela's oil reserves. This is a crucial geopolitical angle that is often overlooked. Had the U.S. not stepped in to freeze and eventually manage these oil shipments, the creditors in Moscow and Beijing would likely have seized them outright to settle debts. In that scenario, the value of the oil would have disappeared into the coffers of foreign adversaries. By asserting control, the U.S. ensured that the equity remained with the Venezuelan people. The kidnapping accusation ignores this reality that the U.S. action was a defensive maneuver to save Venezuela's future liquidity from being swallowed by predatory lending agreements signed by the dictatorship. As we dig deeper into the logistics of this specific transfer, we see the fingerprints of career diplomats and energy experts who have served under multiple administrations. This continuity is vital evidence against the rogue Trump theory. The protocols used to clear the Orinoco Star for entry into the port of Houston are standard, rigid, and bureaucratic. They cannot be overridden by a simple phone call from the White House. The Environmental Protection Agency, the Customs and Border Protection, and the Department of Energy all had to sign off. The idea that all these agencies conspired to commit a federal crime under the guise of an oil deal is a conspiracy theory that collapses under the weight of its own complexity. The atmosphere at the port today is one of serious industrial efficiency, but the subtext is historic. We are witnessing the vindication of a strategy that prioritized long-term outcomes over short-term optics. The maximum pressure campaign was ugly. It resulted in shortages and diplomatic shouting matches. It made it easy for opponents to use words like cruelty and kidnapping. But looking at the result, a free Venezuela, a funded recovery, and the lawful processing of its natural resources, the strategy appears to have been the only path that avoided a full-scale military invasion. It is also worth noting the reaction from the international community today. Capitals that were once critical of the U.S. approach are now silent or supportive as the funds begin to transfer. The European Union, which had hesitated to fully embrace the sanctions regime, has now recognized the legitimacy of the sale. This international consensus serves as a retroactive endorsement. It suggests that while the rhetoric was heated, the legal rationale provided by the U.S. State Department behind closed doors was convincing to global allies. They understood that this was not a theft, but a necessary holding pattern. The kidnapping. The narrative relied on the audience not understanding the difference between a sovereign state and a criminal regime. The U.S. position, vindicated by this sale, was that the Maduro clique had lost its sovereign immunity by engaging in state-sponsored terrorism and drug trafficking. Therefore, the actions taken against them were law enforcement actions, not acts of war or abduction. This is a subtle but powerful distinction that defines the legacy of this foreign policy decision. As the sun sets over the refinery, the pumps are still running, moving millions of gallons of heavy crude into American storage tanks. But the real transfer taking place is the transfer of truth. The shadow of criminality that hung over the Trump administration, OS dealings with Venezuela, is being scrubbed away by the transparency of this event. We are seeing that in the chaotic arena of international regime change, order can eventually emerge, provided the legal foundations were laid correctly at the start.